The crisp mountain air should have made our family trip feel refreshing, a much-needed break from the dull routine of everyday life in suburban Boston. Instead, as we arrived at the lakeside resort nestled in the heart of the White Mountains, an unsettling discomfort settled in my chest. The picturesque scenery of Lake Winnipesaukee, with its sparkling waters and dense pine forests, did little to ease the tension that had been building since we left our home in Lexington. I'm Sarah Thompson, a 32-year-old elementary school teacher, married to David for 5 years now. This trip was supposed to be a celebration of sorts. David had recently gotten a promotion at his law firm, and his parents, the ever-critical Barbara and Richard, had insisted on treating us to a weekend getaway. I should have known better than to expect a peaceful retreat. The drive up had been pleasant enough, with David and I chatting about our plans for the weekend, hiking, kayaking, maybe even trying our hand at fishing. But as soon as we pulled into the resort's parking lot and saw Barbara and Richard's sleek Mercedes already there, my stomach twisted into knots. "Ready, honey?" David asked, giving my hand a reassuring squeeze. I nodded, forcing a smile. Maybe this time would be different, I told myself. Maybe Barbara would finally warm up to me, and Richard would crack a joke that wasn't at my expense. As we walked into the lobby, the scent of pine and wood smoke filled the air, reminding me of childhood camping trips with my own family. For a moment, I felt a pang of homesickness for those simpler times, before I had to navigate the minefield of in-law relationships. Barbara spotted us first, her perfectly coiffed silver hair bouncing as she waved us over. "David, darling," she called out, completely ignoring my presence. Richard stood beside her, his usual stoic expression in place as he nodded a greeting. "Mom, Dad," David said, hugging them both. "The drive wasn't too bad, was it?" "Oh, not at all," Barbara replied, her Boston Brahmin accent as pronounced as ever. "Though I do wish you'd taken our offer to fly up. It would have been so much more comfortable." I bit my tongue, resisting the urge to point out that a 2-hour drive was hardly worth a flight. Instead, I smiled and said, "The scenic route was lovely, actually. The fall colors are just starting to come in." Barbara's eyes flickered to me, as if just noticing I was there. "Oh, Sarah. Yes, I suppose you would enjoy that sort of thing." Before I could respond, the concierge called us over to check-in. I breathed a sigh of relief, grateful for the momentary distraction. As David handled the paperwork, I found myself daydreaming about the weekend ahead. Maybe we could sneak away for a private hike, just the two of us. Or spend an afternoon by the lake, reading books and enjoying each other's company without the constant scrutiny of his parents. "All set," David announced, pulling me from my reverie. "They've got us in adjoining suites on the top floor. Great views of the lake, apparently." That's when it happened. The moment that would change everything. Barbara, with her usual condescending smirk, turned to me and uttered words that sent a chill of humiliation down my spine. "The rooms are only for family. But don't worry, Sarah, you can sleep in the garage. It suits you, haha." The laughter that followed from Richard solidified my status as an outsider in their eyes. The concierge looked uncomfortable, averting his gaze and busying himself with some papers on the desk. I stood there, frozen, the words echoing in my head. "Only for family. The garage suits you." Each syllable felt like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of me. I glanced at David, expecting, hoping, he would step in and protest. But he stood there, shifting uncomfortably, his eyes darting between his parents and me. "Mom," he said weakly, "that's not funny." But he didn't defend me. He didn't look at me. He didn't wrap an arm around me or tell his mother that I was family. My stomach tightened, and a sharp pang of betrayal burned in my chest. This wasn't the first time Barbara had made a cutting remark, or Richard had joined in with his cruel chuckles. But it was the first time they had been so blatant, so public in their disdain for me. I thought about all the times I had bitten my tongue. The Thanksgiving when Barbara had criticized my turkey for being too dry. The Christmas when Richard had jokingly asked if my family had enough money for presents that year. The countless dinners where I sat silently as they praised David's accomplishments and pointedly ignored mine. David had always been passive when it came to his parents' subtle cruelty. "That's just how they are," he'd say. "They don't mean anything by it." But this This was beyond cruel, it was outright degrading. My dignity was on the line, and staying there meant accepting their treatment. I could feel the eyes of other guests in the lobby on us. A couple near the fireplace whispered to each other, shooting sympathetic glances my way. A family with young children hurried past, the parents clearly trying to shield their kids from the uncomfortable scene. Barbara stood there, her smirk still in place, clearly waiting for me to break down or cause a scene. Richard looked bored, as if this was all beneath him. And David? David just stood there, a pained expression on his face, but making no move to stand up for me. In that moment, I saw our entire relationship flash before my eyes. The early days when we were so in love, talking about building a life together. The first time I met his parents and felt that initial chill of disapproval. The gradual erosion of my self-esteem as I tried harder and harder to win their approval, only to be met with more criticism and disdain. I saw our future, too. Years of holidays spent walking on eggshells. The possibility of children, and how Barbara and Richard would treat them, favoring those who looked more like David, perhaps, or criticizing any traits they inherited from me. The slow poison of resentment that would seep into my marriage as David continually chose his parents' comfort over my dignity. I nodded slowly, feigning calmness, though my heart pounded with a mix of anger and disbelief. Then, without a word, I turned on my heel and walked out of the hotel lobby. No one chased after me, not David, not his parents. As I stepped outside into the cool New Hampshire night air, I made a silent vow, they would regret this. The parking lot was quiet, with only the distant sound of loons calling across the lake. I took a deep breath, the scent of pine and wood smoke now seeming oppressive rather than comforting. My car sat there, a modest Subaru that Barbara had once sneeringly referred to as quaint. As I walked towards it, my mind raced. What would I do now? Where would I go? The thought of driving all the way back to Boston tonight was daunting, but the idea of staying here, of facing them over breakfast in the morning, was unbearable. Just as I reached for my car door, I heard footsteps behind me. For a moment, my heart leapt. Was it David, coming to apologize, to make things right? But when I turned, I saw it was the concierge, a young man probably in his early 20s. He said, slightly out of breath. I'm so sorry about what happened in there. It was completely unacceptable. If you'd like, we have a separate cabin available. On the house, of course. You shouldn't have to leave because of that. His kindness, in stark contrast to the cruelty I just experienced, almost broke me. I felt tears pricking at the corners of my eyes but blinked them back. Thank you, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. That's very kind. But I think it's best if I go. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. Of course. Drive safely, and I hope you'll consider coming back another time, when you can truly enjoy it. As he walked away, I sat in my car, hands gripping the steering wheel. The reality of what had just happened began to sink in. This wasn't just about a sleeping arrangement or a cruel joke. This was about years of subtle and not so subtle put-downs, of being made to feel less than, of my husband's failure to stand up for me. I started the car, the familiar rumble somewhat comforting. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I caught a glimpse of the hotel in my rearview mirror. I could see figures in the lobby. Were they looking for me? Did they even care that I was gone? It didn't matter. As I turned onto the main road, leaving the lake and the pines behind, I felt something shift inside me. The hurt was still there, raw and throbbing. But underneath it, something else was growing. Determination. Anger. A resolve to never let myself be treated this way again. The road ahead was dark, winding through the mountains. But as I drove, my headlights illuminating the way, I realized something. This wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning. And whatever came next, I would face it on my own terms. As I navigated the winding roads leading away from Lake Winnipesaukee, the enormity of what had just happened began to sink in. The warm glow of the resort's lights faded in my rearview mirror, replaced by the darkness of the New Hampshire night. I was alone, truly alone, for the first time in years. The drive back to Boston would take at least 2 hours, but I welcomed the solitude. It gave me time to process, to let the anger and hurt wash over me in waves. The road stretched out before me, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the dense forests of the White Mountains. In the darkness, I could barely make out the silhouettes of the towering pines against the night sky. I thought about turning on the radio, but the silence felt appropriate. It matched the hollowness I felt inside. As I passed through small towns, Meredith, Tilton, Concord, I saw families through lit windows, going about their evening routines. It all seemed so normal, so far removed from the chaos of my own life. About an hour into the drive, I pulled over at a rest stop. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a couple of truckers catching some sleep. I sat there, engine idling, and finally let the tears come. They weren't quiet, dignified tears. No, these were ugly, racking sobs that shook my entire body. I cried for the humiliation I'd endured, for the years of subtle abuse I'd put up with, and most of all, for the betrayal of my husband. David. Just thinking his name sent a fresh wave of pain through me. How could he have just stood there? How could he have let his mother treat me that way? I remembered the day he proposed, right here in these very mountains. We'd been hiking, and he'd gotten down on one knee at the summit, pledging his love and loyalty. Where was that loyalty now? As my sobs subsided, I felt a new emotion taking hold. Anger. No, more than that, rage. Cold, calculating rage. They thought they could treat me like an outsider. Fine. I would show them exactly what that entailed. I pulled back onto the highway, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. As I drove, I began to plan. This wasn't just about tonight. This was about years of snide comments, of backhanded compliments, of being made to feel less than. It was about David's constant failure to stand up for me, his willingness to sacrifice my dignity for his parents' approval. By the time I reached the outskirts of Boston, my mind was made up. This would be the last time they ever treated me like this. I wouldn't beg for their approval anymore. I wouldn't silently endure their cruelty. And if David couldn't see how wrong this all was, well, maybe our marriage wasn't as strong as I'd thought. It was past midnight when I finally pulled into our driveway in Lexington. Our house, my house, I reminded myself, stood dark and quiet. It was a modest Cape Cod-style home, nothing like the grand mansion David had grown up in, but it was ours. Or so I'd thought. As I stepped out of the car, the cool night air hit me, carrying with it the scent of Mrs. Chen's rose garden next door. How many times had Barbara wrinkled her nose at those roses, complaining about the common scent? How often had she suggested we move to a better neighborhood, one more befitting David's status as a rising star in his law firm? I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The familiar scent of home, a mix of the lavender candles I loved and the old books David collected, usually brought comfort. Tonight, it felt different. I saw everything through new eyes. The throw pillows Barbara had given us, to add a touch of class, the pretentious art pieces Richard had insisted would cultured up the place, the expensive coffee maker that stood unused because neither David nor I actually liked coffee. How much of our life had been shaped by their expectations? How much of myself had I suppressed, trying to fit into their world? I walked through the rooms, turning on lights as I went. In the kitchen, I saw the expensive china set Barbara had gifted us for our wedding. Every proper home needs fine china, she'd said, her tone making it clear she didn't consider our home proper at all. I'd always hated those plates, with their fussy gold trim and delicate flowers. Without thinking, I picked one up and hurled it against the wall. The crash was satisfying, the shards of porcelain scattering across the floor a physical representation of my shattered illusions. For a moment, I stood there, breathing heavily. Then, slowly, methodically, I began to clean up the mess. As I swept up the broken pieces, I felt a strange calm settle over me. This was a turning point. I couldn't control how David's family treated me, but I could control how I responded. I could control my own space, my own life. I made my way to the home office, pulling out the file cabinet where all our paperwork was stored. I rifled through folders until I found what I was looking for, the deed to the house. My name was the only one on it. David and I had talked about adding his name after the marriage, but somehow we'd never gotten around to it. Now, I was grateful for that oversight. A slow smile spread across my lips as an idea took full form in my mind. If they thought they could make me feel unwelcome, I was about to return the favor in grand fashion. I spent the next few hours making calls and sending emails. First, I contacted a locksmith, arranging for them to come first thing in the morning to change all the locks. Then, I reached out to a security company about updating our home system. I wanted everything changed, new codes, new protocols, the works. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, I sat at the kitchen table, a cup of tea growing cold beside me, and drafted a formal letter. It was a notice, revoking any standing invitation David's family had to stay in or visit my home. I chose my words carefully, making it clear that this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision, but a response to years of mistreatment. Was I being dramatic? Perhaps. But I wanted them to feel the weight of their actions. I wanted them to understand that their behavior had consequences. The final step was the most cathartic. I went through the house, room by room, gathering up everything that belonged to Barbara and Richard. The clothes they kept here for their frequent visits. The personal items they'd left scattered around as if they owned the place. I even packed up that ridiculous tea set Barbara had insisted on keeping in my kitchen, the one she used to make snide comments about my quaint mugs. As I packed everything into boxes, I felt lighter with each item I removed from my space. It was like I was physically excising their presence from my life. I labeled each box carefully and stacked them by the front door, ready for their arrival. By the time I finished, the morning sun was streaming through the windows. I stood in the living room, surveying my work. The house already felt different, cleaner somehow, as if I'd cleared out more than just physical objects. I knew the hard part was yet to come. David would be returning soon, probably confused and angry. His parents would no doubt have their own dramatic reaction to my actions. But for the first time in years, I felt ready to face them. I wasn't going to back down, wasn't going to apologize for standing up for myself. As I waited for the locksmith to arrive, I made myself another cup of tea, using one of my quaint mugs, of course. I sat on the porch, watching the neighborhood come to life. Mr. Rodriguez across the street was walking his dog. The Wilson kids next door were waiting for the school bus, their excited chatter carrying on the morning breeze. This was my community, my home. I'd let David's family make me feel like an outsider here for too long. No more. Whatever happened next, I was reclaiming my space, my dignity, my life. Let them come, I thought. I'm ready. The locksmith's van pulled into the driveway, and I stood up, squaring my shoulders. It was time to start this new chapter of my life. A chapter where I called the shots, where I didn't let anyone, not even family, undermine my worth. As I walked to greet the locksmith, I felt a surge of determination. This was just the beginning. The locksmith, a middle-aged man named Mike, worked efficiently, replacing all the locks in the house. As he worked, I found myself explaining the situation to him, the words pouring out before I could stop them. "Sounds like you're doing the right thing," Mike said as he finished up. "Nobody deserves to be treated like that, especially not in their own home." His simple validation nearly brought me to tears again, but I held it together. I had work to do. As soon as Mike left, I got back to my task list. The security company was due to arrive in an hour to update the system. In the meantime, I focused on the interior of the house. I started in the living room, rearranging the furniture to my liking. The pretentious abstract painting Richard had insisted we hang over the fireplace came down, replaced by a landscape I'd painted years ago but had never felt confident enough to display. In the kitchen, I cleared out the cabinets of all the fancy gadgets and appliances Barbara had gifted us over the years, things we never used but felt obligated to keep. The expensive coffee maker, the bread machine, the sous vide cooker, all of it went into boxes. In their place, I unpacked my old, reliable appliances from college that I'd stored away, feeling a sense of nostalgia as I set up my trusty toaster oven and electric kettle. As I worked, I thought about the years I'd spent trying to mold myself into someone the Thompsons would approve of. I'd changed my wardrobe, learned to make small talk about the stock market, even taken up golf, which I hated, just to fit in with their country club crowd. And for what? To be told I wasn't family? To be relegated to the garage like an unwanted piece of furniture? The security team arrived just as I finished in the kitchen. They were professional and efficient, updating our system with new codes and even installing a few additional cameras around the property. As they worked, I couldn't help but imagine the look on Barbara's face when she realized she couldn't just waltz in whenever she pleased anymore. By mid-afternoon, the physical changes to the house were complete. But there was still more to do. I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and began the process of securing my digital life. I changed all the passwords on our shared accounts, Netflix, Amazon, even our joint bank account. I wasn't planning to take David's money, but I wanted control over my own finances. As I worked, I realized how much of my life had become entangled with David's and, by extension, with his family's. It was like unraveling a complex knot, carefully separating the strands of my identity from theirs. It was painstaking work, but with each account secured, each password changed, I felt a growing sense of empowerment. Next, I turned my attention to the legal aspects of my plan. I wasn't a lawyer, but I'd picked up enough from David to know I needed to protect myself. I spent the next hour researching local divorce attorneys, making a list of those who specialized in high-conflict cases. I wasn't sure if I was ready to take that step yet, but I wanted to be prepared. As evening approached, I took a break to eat something, realizing I hadn't had anything since the night before. I made myself a simple sandwich, using the everyday plates Barbara had always turned her nose up at. As I ate, I looked around the kitchen, now free of the Thompsons' influence. It felt more like home than it had in years. After dinner, I returned to my desk to draft the formal notice I'd been thinking about since the drive home. I wanted it to be clear, concise, and leave no room for misinterpretation. I wrote, "To David, Barbara, and Richard Thompson, this letter serves as formal notice that you are no longer welcome in my home at 147 Maple Street, Lexington, Massachusetts. The locks have been changed, and the security system updated. Any attempt to enter the property without my express written permission will be considered trespassing, and appropriate legal action will be taken. This decision comes after years of disrespect, condescension, and outright hostility, culminating in the events of last night at Lake Winnipesaukee. I will no longer tolerate being treated as less than family in my own home. All personal belongings left in the house have been packed and will be available for collection at a neutral location to be determined. Sarah Mitchell." I read over the letter several times, tweaking the wording here and there. It felt strange to see my maiden name, Mitchell, at the bottom. I hadn't used it in years, but it felt right. It was a reclamation of my identity, a statement that I was my own person, not just an extension of the Thompson family. With the letter drafted, I turned my attention to the practical matters of the next few days. I called my principal at the elementary school where I taught, explaining that I needed to take a few personal days. She was understanding, telling me to take the time I needed. I was grateful for the support, another reminder that I had a life and identity outside of the Thompson family drama. As night fell, I found myself wandering through the house, taking in all the changes. The place felt different, lighter somehow, as if the very air had cleared. In the guest room, which had essentially become Barbara and Richard's room over the years, I stripped the bed of its expensive linens, replacing them with my old college bedding. The room transformed from a stuffy, formal space to something cozy and inviting. In my bedroom, I packed up David's clothes, neatly folding each item and placing it in suitcases. It was a surreal experience, like I was packing for a trip he'd never return from. As I worked, I found myself remembering moments from our relationship, our first date, the day we moved in together, our wedding day. Had I been so blinded by love that I hadn't seen the signs? Or had David changed over the years, slowly but surely prioritizing his parents' approval over our relationship? By midnight, the house was transformed. David's presence had been neatly packed away, his parents' influence erased. I stood in the middle of the living room, taking it all in. The house felt like mine now, truly mine, perhaps for the first time since we'd bought it. As I got ready for bed, I realized I was exhausted, physically and emotionally drained. But underneath the fatigue was a current of excitement, of anticipation. Tomorrow would bring confrontation, no doubt. David and his parents would return, and they would be angry. But for the first time in years, I felt ready to face them on my own terms. I climbed into bed, my bed now, and found myself smiling. Whatever happened tomorrow, I knew I'd done the right thing. I'd stood up for myself, reclaimed my space, my identity. As I drifted off to sleep, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. The next morning, I woke early, feeling refreshed despite the emotional turmoil of the past 24 hours. I went through my usual routine, a quick jog around the neighborhood, followed by a shower and breakfast. As I sipped my tea, from my favorite mug, not Barbara's china, I mentally prepared myself for the confrontation to come. I didn't know exactly when David and his parents would arrive, but I wanted to be ready. I dressed carefully, choosing an outfit that made me feel confident and strong, a far cry from the demure, country club appropriate clothes Barbara had always pushed me towards. As I waited, I double-checked everything. The boxes by the door were neatly labeled. The formal notice was printed and ready. The new security system was armed and functioning. I was as prepared as I could be. Around mid-morning, I heard the crunch of tires on the driveway. My heart rate spiked, but I took a deep breath, steadying myself. This was it. The moment of truth. I stood up, smoothed down my clothes, and walked to the front door. Whatever happened next, I was ready to face it head-on. No more shrinking Violet, no more silent endurance. This was my stand, and I was going to make it count. The sound of car doors slamming echoed through the quiet suburban street. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. Through the front window, I could see David's car in the driveway, with his parents' Mercedes pulled up behind it. They were here. I opened the front door before they could ring the bell or try their old keys. The look of shock on their faces as they saw me standing there, calm and collected, was almost comical. Barbara's perfectly coiffed hair seemed slightly disheveled, probably from the frantic drive back. Richard's usual stoic expression was replaced by one of confusion and anger. And David? David looked lost, his eyes darting between me and his parents. "Sarah," David started, his voice a mix of relief and wariness. "We've been trying to call you. We were worried sick." I nodded, keeping my face neutral. "I'm sure you were. Please, come in. We have some things to discuss." I stepped aside, allowing them to enter. As they filed past me, I could see the moment they realized something was different. The house had changed, and so had I. Gone was the meek, accommodating daughter-in-law they were used to pushing around. In her place stood a woman who knew her worth and was ready to fight for it. Barbara was the first to recover from the shock. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, gesturing at the boxes stacked neatly by the door. "What have you done to our things?" "Your things are packed and ready for you to take," I replied calmly. "As for the meaning, I think that should be clear. You made it abundantly clear last night that I'm not family. So, I've decided to take that to its logical conclusion." Richard's face turned an alarming shade of red. "Now see here, young lady," he began, but I cut him off. "No, you see here," I said, my voice firm but not raised. "For years, I've put up with your condescension, your snide remarks, your constant belittling. I've tried to fit into your world, to be the daughter-in-law you wanted. But last night, you crossed a line. And now, we're going to do things differently." I handed each of them a copy of the formal notice I'd prepared. "This is a formal revocation of any invitation you might have had to this house. The locks have been changed, the security system updated. This is my home, and you are no longer welcome here." The silence that followed was deafening. Barbara's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Richard seemed to be on the verge of an apoplectic fit. But it was David's reaction I was most interested in. He stood there, reading the notice, his brow furrowed. "Sarah," he said finally, his voice quiet. "Don't you think this is a bit extreme? I know what Mom said was out of line, but dash out of line?" I repeated, incredulous. "David, she told me to sleep in the garage. And you just stood there. You didn't defend me, didn't stand up for me. Do you have any idea how that felt?" David at least had the decency to look ashamed. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have said something. But this, kicking my parents out, changing the locks, don't you think we should talk about this?" We are talking about it, I replied. Right now. And this isn't just about last night. This is about years of mistreatment, years of you choosing your parents over me. I'm done being the family punching bag. Barbara, having finally found her voice, jumped in. This is ridiculous. You can't just kick us out. We have rights. I turned to her, feeling a strange calm wash over me. Actually, Barbara, you don't. This house is in my name. You have no legal right to be here if I don't want you here. And right now, I very much don't want you here. Richard, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly exploded. You ungrateful little dash, he began, taking a step towards me. But before he could finish, David stepped between us. Dad, stop, he said, his voice firm for the first time. This isn't helping. I felt a flicker of hope at David's intervention, but it was quickly extinguished by his next words. Sarah, honey, I know you're upset. But this is my family. We can't just cut them out of our lives. Let's all calm down and talk about this rationally. And there it was. Even now, even after everything, he was still choosing them over me. I felt something inside me harden, a resolve solidifying. No, David, I said, my voice steady. We're past the point of talking. I've made my decision. You need to make yours. Either you stand with me, or you stand with them. But you can't have it both ways anymore. The room fell silent again, all eyes on David. I could see the conflict playing out on his face, the war between the man he wanted to be and the son he had always been. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope that he would choose me, that he would finally stand up to his parents and be the partner I needed. But as the silence stretched on, I knew. I knew before he even opened his mouth what his choice would be. And in that moment, I felt the last thread of our marriage snap. I can't choose, David said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. They're my parents, Sarah. I can't just cut them out. I nodded, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over me. Then you've made your choice, I said. And I've made mine. I walked over to the boxes by the door, picking up the one labeled David's things. Here, I said, handing it to him. I've packed what you'll need for a few days. The rest of your stuff is in the guest room. You can come get it later, when I'm not here. David took the box automatically, looking stunned. Sarah, what are you saying? I'm saying it's over, David, I replied, surprised at how steady my voice was. I'm saying I deserve better than this, better than you. I'm saying you should leave now, and take your parents with you. Barbara, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly found her voice again. You can't do this, she screeched. You have no right. I turned to her, feeling a surge of pity mixed with disgust. I have every right, Barbara. This is my house, my life. And I'm taking it back. Richard looked like he was about to explode again, but David put a hand on his arm. Dad, don't, he said quietly. Let's just go. As they moved towards the door, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. This was it. The end of a chapter, but also the beginning of a new one. A chapter where I was the author, not just a character in someone else's story. Just as they were about to leave, I remembered one last thing. I went to the kitchen and came back with a small box. Here, I said, handing it to Barbara. Your precious china. Wouldn't want you to forget it. Barbara took the box, looking like she'd been slapped. For once, she seemed at a loss for words. As they filed out the door, David turned back one last time. Sarah, please, he said, his voice breaking. Can't we talk about this? I looked at him, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in years. I saw the boy I'd fallen in love with, but I also saw the man who had consistently failed to stand up for me, who had allowed his parents to belittle and demean me for years. We're done talking, David, I said softly. Good luck with your life. I hope you find what you're looking for. And with that, I closed the door. I heard their cars start up, heard them pull out of the driveway. And then, silence. Beautiful, peaceful silence. I walked back into the living room, looking around at the house that was now truly mine. There was a moment of vertigo, a sudden realization of how much my life had changed in just 24 hours. But underneath the shock and the lingering pain, there was something else. Something that felt a lot like freedom. I sat down on the couch, letting out a long breath. It was over. The confrontation I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure had come and gone. And I had survived. More than survived, I had stood my ground, had advocated for myself in a way I never had before. As the adrenaline of the confrontation began to fade, I felt tears start to well up. But these weren't tears of sadness or regret. They were tears of relief, of release. Years of pent-up frustration and hurt were finally finding an outlet. I allowed myself to cry, really cry, for what felt like hours. And when the tears finally stopped, I felt lighter, cleansed. As if I'd washed away years of accumulated resentment and self-doubt. Getting up, I walked to the window. The street outside was quiet, peaceful. Life was going on as normal, even though my world had just been turned upside down. But as I stood there, watching the world go by, I realized something. This wasn't the end. It was a beginning. A fresh start. And for the first time in years, I was excited about what the future might hold. The house felt eerily quiet in the wake of the confrontation. I stood by the window, watching as David's car and his parents' Mercedes disappeared around the corner. The finality of the moment hit me like a physical blow. It was done. I had stood my ground, and in doing so, I had effectively ended my marriage. I moved away from the window, my legs feeling unsteady. The adrenaline that had been coursing through my veins during the confrontation was starting to ebb, leaving me feeling drained and slightly disoriented. I made my way to the kitchen, mechanically going through the motions of making a cup of tea. The familiar ritual helped ground me, giving my hands something to do while my mind raced. As the kettle boiled, I found myself staring at the empty space where Barbara's china cabinet used to stand. I had given her back her precious tea set, the one she had used as a weapon to make me feel inferior countless times. Now, the space it left behind felt symbolic of the changes I had made, a void that I could fill with something of my own choosing. With my tea in hand, I settled onto the couch in the living room. The house was mine now, truly mine, but it felt strange. Empty. Not just physically, but emotionally. For years, my life had revolved around David and, by extension, his family. Now that I had cut them out, I was faced with the daunting task of figuring out who I was without them. My phone buzzed insistently on the coffee table. I picked it up to see a barrage of messages and missed calls from David. I scrolled through them, my heart clenching despite my resolve. "Sarah, please, can we talk about this? I'm sorry. I should have stood up for you. Let me make it right. Don't do anything rash. We can work this out. I love you. Please don't let it end like this." I put the phone down without responding. David's words were too little, too late. Where was this concern when his mother was humiliating me? Where was this desire to make it right when I was being treated like a second-class citizen in my own family? As the day wore on, I found myself wandering through the house, taking stock of the changes I had made. In the guest room, no longer Barbara and Richard's room, I ran my hand over the old college bedding I had put on the bed. It was a small act of defiance, replacing their expensive, fussy linens with something that represented my life before them. Before I had started trying to mold myself into someone I wasn't just to gain their approval. In my bedroom, I opened the closet to see the empty space where David's clothes used to hang. The sight brought a fresh wave of emotion. This was real. This was happening. I was really on my own. But as I stood there, looking at the space David had left behind, I realized something. It wasn't just empty space. It was possibility. Room for growth. Room for me to rediscover who I was without the constant pressure to be someone else. I spent the rest of the afternoon making calls. First to my parents, explaining in halting words what had happened. They were shocked, of course, but supportive. My mom offered to come stay with me for a few days, but I declined. As much as I appreciated the offer, I needed this time alone to process everything. Next, I called my best friend, Lizzie. She had never liked David much, always saying he didn't appreciate me. I could almost hear her restraining herself from saying "I told you so" as I recounted the events of the past 2 days. "You did the right thing, Sarah," she said firmly. You deserve so much better than that. I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself." Her words bolstered me, reminding me why I had taken this drastic step. I wasn't just running away from a bad situation, I was running towards a better life for myself. As evening fell, I ordered takeout from my favorite Thai place, something Barbara had always turned her nose up at, claiming it was too spicy and not refined enough. I ate directly from the container, relishing the small act of rebellion. Just as I was finishing my meal, my phone rang again. It was David. I stared at the screen for a long moment, debating whether to answer. Finally, taking a deep breath, I picked up. "Sarah," David's voice was strained. "Please, can we talk about this? I know I messed up, but David," I cut him off, surprised at how steady my voice sounded. "There's nothing to talk about. You made your choice. You've been making that same choice for years. I'm just finally accepting it. But I love you," he pleaded. "We can work this out. I'll stand up to my parents, I promise. Just give me another chance." I closed my eyes, feeling a wave of sadness wash over me. "That's the problem, David. You're only willing to stand up to them now that you're facing consequences. Where was this resolve all the times I needed you before? Where was it last night when your mother told me to sleep in the garage?" I don't know," he admitted. "I was wrong. I see that now. But people can change, Sarah. I can change." "Maybe you can," I said softly. "But it's too late for us. I deserve someone who doesn't need to change to treat me with respect. Someone who values me as I am, not as an afterthought to his parents' wishes." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When David spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "What about our life together? Our plans? Are you really willing to throw all that away?" The question gave me pause. Were those really our plans? Or were they the plans his parents had for us, the life they thought we should have? I realized with a start that I couldn't remember the last time David and I had made a decision about our future without considering how his parents would react. "I'm not throwing anything away, David," I said finally. "I'm reclaiming my life. My identity. The woman you married got lost somewhere along the way, trying to be the person your parents wanted me to be. I need to find her again, and I can't do that with you. So that's it then?" The defeat in his voice was palpable. "It's over." "Yes," I said, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. "It's over. I'll have my lawyer contact you about the divorce proceedings." After I hung up, I sat in silence for a long time, letting the reality of what I had done sink in. I had just ended my marriage. The life I had known for the past 5 years was over. It was terrifying, but also exhilarating. As I got ready for bed that night, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at me seemed different somehow. Stronger. More confident. There was a spark in her eyes that I hadn't seen in years. I climbed into bed, my bed now, and found myself smiling despite the emotional turmoil of the day. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, no doubt. There would be practical matters to deal with: lawyers, finances, telling friends and colleagues about the divorce. But for the first time in years, I felt ready to face those challenges head-on. As I drifted off to sleep, I realized something. The hardest part wasn't over, it was just beginning. But I had taken the first step. I had stood up for myself, had refused to be treated as less than I was worth. And that was a victory in itself. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. I met with a divorce lawyer, started the process of disentangling my finances from David's, and began to think about what I wanted my life to look like moving forward. There were moments of doubt, of course. Times when the enormity of what I had done threatened to overwhelm me. But each time, I reminded myself of why I had taken this step. I thought of Barbara's smirk as she told me to sleep in the garage, of Richard's dismissive chuckles, of David's silence in the face of their cruelty. And each time, my resolve strengthened. A week after the confrontation, I received a letter from Barbara. For a moment, I considered throwing it away unopened. But curiosity got the better of me. Inside, I found a terse, formal apology, clearly written under duress, probably at David's insistence. It rang hollow, devoid of any real understanding or remorse. I placed the letter in a drawer, neither accepting nor rejecting the apology. It was a reminder of where I had been, and why I could never go back. As I closed the drawer, I felt a sense of closure. The chapter of my life that included the Thompsons was over. It was time to start writing a new one. The first rays of morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, gently rousing me from sleep. For a moment, as consciousness slowly returned, I felt a familiar pang of anxiety. But then I remembered I was free. The house was quiet, peaceful. No need to tiptoe around, trying not to disturb David or worrying about what Barbara might say if she dropped by unannounced. It had been 3 months since that fateful day when I stood up to the Thompsons and reclaimed my life. 3 months of challenges, of self-discovery, of learning to live on my own terms. The journey hadn't been easy, but with each passing day, I felt more like myself, the self I had almost forgotten existed. I got out of bed, padding barefoot to the kitchen to make my morning coffee. The house looked different now. Gone were the stuffy, formal furnishings that Barbara had insisted on. In their place were pieces that reflected my personality, colorful throw pillows, artwork from local artists, and photographs from my travels. The space felt lighter, more vibrant. Just like I did. As I sipped my coffee, I scrolled through my phone, smiling at a text from Lizzie. We had plans to meet for brunch later. Our friendship had deepened over the past months, with Lizzie providing unwavering support as I navigated my new life. My divorce from David was nearly finalized. The process had been surprisingly amicable, all things considered. David, to his credit, hadn't fought me on anything. Perhaps he finally understood the depth of his failure as a partner. Or maybe he was just tired of the conflict. Either way, I was grateful for the lack of drama. I hadn't heard from Barbara or Richard since that terse apology letter. David had mentioned, during one of our necessary conversations about the divorce, that they were processing everything. I couldn't help but wonder if they had learned anything from the experience. Part of me hoped they had, if only for David's sake. But I no longer let their opinions occupy space in my mind. After breakfast, I changed into my running gear. This was a new habit I'd picked up, part of my efforts to rediscover who I was and what I enjoyed. The old Sarah, the one who existed before the Thompsons, had loved being active. Somewhere along the way, I'd let that part of myself fade away, too busy trying to fit into the sedentary, country club lifestyle that Barbara approved of. As I ran through the neighborhood, waving to familiar faces, I marveled at how much had changed. Mrs. Chen, tending to her beloved roses, called out a cheerful good morning. Mr. Rodriguez and his dog, Max, were out for their usual walk. These were my neighbors, my community. I'd always felt like an outsider here, viewed through the lens of the Thompsons' disapproval. Now, I was forming real connections, being part of the neighborhood in a way I never had before. Back home, showered and changed, I spent some time working on my latest project. With the encouragement of my therapist, another positive change I'd made, I'd started writing again. Nothing professional, just a blog about my experiences. It had started as a form of therapy, a way to process everything I'd been through. But to my surprise, it had gained a following. Women in similar situations had reached out, thanking me for putting into words what they were feeling. Writing had become a source of joy and purpose. Each post felt like reclaiming another piece of myself, sharing my story on my own terms. It was healing, not just for me, but for others too. The thought that my experiences could help someone else gave me a sense of meaning I'd been missing for a long time. At noon, I met Lizzie at our favorite cafe. As always, her vibrant personality lit up the room. "Sarah," she exclaimed, pulling me into a hug. "You look amazing. Freedom suits you, girl." I laughed, settling into my seat. "Thanks, Liz. I feel amazing, most of the time anyway." We ordered our usual avocado toast for me, blueberry pancakes for Lizzie, and fell into easy conversation. Lizzie updated me on her life, her latest dating escapades, and her work drama. It felt good to just be a friend, to listen and offer advice, without the weight of my own problems overshadowing everything. "So," Lizzie said, leaning forward conspiratorially after the waiter had cleared our plates. "Spill. Any developments in the romance department?" That cute history teacher at your school still giving you the eye? I felt a blush creep up my cheeks. Liz, come on. I'm barely divorced. It's too soon to think about dating. Lizzie raised an eyebrow. Is it? You've been separated for months. You're young, you're gorgeous, and you're finally free from those awful Thompsons. Live a little. I shook my head, but I was smiling. I appreciate the vote of confidence, but I'm not ready. I'm still figuring out who I am without David. I need to be comfortable with myself before I can think about being with someone else. Liz's expression softened. I get it. And I'm proud of you, you know? You've come so far. Just don't close yourself off to possibilities, okay? I nodded, touched by her concern. I won't. Promise. After brunch, I decided to take a detour before heading home. I found myself driving to the local community center. I'd been volunteering there on weekends, teaching art classes to kids. It was something I'd always wanted to do but had never found the time for, or rather, had never made the time for, too busy trying to fit into the Thompsons' world. The art room was empty when I arrived, the afternoon sunlight streaming through the large windows. I began setting up for tomorrow's class, laying out paints and brushes, pinning up example artwork. As I worked, I thought about the kids I taught. Their enthusiasm, their creativity, their uninhibited joy in creating something new. They reminded me of myself at that age, before I'd learned to doubt myself, to stifle my own desires in favor of others' expectations. I was so engrossed in my task that I didn't hear someone enter the room. Ms. Mitchell, a voice said, startling me. I turned to see Emma, one of my students, standing in the doorway with her mother. Emma, what a nice surprise, I said, smiling at the shy 10-year-old. Are you excited for class tomorrow? Emma nodded enthusiastically. I can't wait. I've been practicing the shading technique you showed us last week. Her mother stepped forward, extending her hand. Ms. Mitchell, I'm Claire, Emma's mom. I just wanted to thank you for everything you've done for Emma. She talks about your class all the time. It's really brought her out of her shell. I felt a warmth spread through my chest. That's wonderful to hear. Emma is a talented artist. It's a joy to teach her. After they left, I sat down at one of the easels, overcome with emotion. This connection, this ability to make a difference in someone's life, this was what I had been missing. In trying so hard to be the perfect wife, the perfect daughter-in-law, I had lost sight of the things that truly mattered to me. When I finally got home that evening, I felt a sense of contentment that had been absent for far too long. I poured myself a glass of wine, not the expensive stuff Barbara had always insisted on, but a local brand I'd discovered and grown to love, and settled on the porch swing. As I sat there, watching the sun set over the neighborhood, I reflected on the journey of the past few months. The pain, the fear, the uncertainty, it had all been worth it. For the first time in years, I felt truly alive, truly myself. My phone buzzed with a text. It was from David. Signed the last of the papers today. It's done. I know it doesn't mean much now, but I'm sorry for everything. I hope you find happiness, Sarah. You deserve it. I read the message several times, a complex mix of emotions washing over me. There was sadness, yes, for the end of a relationship, for the years we had shared. But more than that, there was relief. And hope. This wasn't just the end of something. It was the beginning of everything. I typed out a reply, "Thank you, David. I hope you find happiness too." Then, after a moment's hesitation, I added, "And I hope you find the strength to live your own life, not the one your parents want for you." As I hit send, I felt the last weight lift from my shoulders. This chapter of my life was well and truly over. But the story wasn't finished. Far from it. This was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where I was the author, the protagonist, the hero of my own life. I raised my glass to the darkening sky, a silent toast to new beginnings, to second chances, to the beauty of becoming who you were always meant to be. The future stretched out before me, full of possibilities. And for the first time in a long time, I couldn't wait to see what it held.